Welcome to Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Scoff.
In this season of Planted, we are exploring the fields of opportunity associated with plant-focused STEM careers. That's right, all the cool industries and places you can work with plants. And a lot of times we talk with scientists, a range of fields, but the National Science Foundation actually defines STEM fields, including math, natural sciences, engineering, computer and information sciences, as well as the social and behavioral sciences like psychology, economics, sociology, and political science. So today we're going to kind of delve into some of those other parts of STEM as we explore the field of legislation.
It is with great honor that I can introduce you to a brilliant mind and just a totally awesome person, Kathleen Kennedy. Kathleen is a senior policy analyst at Maryland General Assembly, and she holds both a master's in public policy and a law degree. Kathleen, thank you so much for being here today. I'm thrilled to have you on because this is like a really unique take on STEM that we haven't done yet on Planted.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you both. You're creative and smart women, and I love having conversations with people like that.
Oh, thank you.
So, Kathleen, we'll start off with something that's going to seem a little strange, but it's one way that we introduce all of our guests is that we take three things that are seemingly random, but they all have to do with you and give our listeners an opportunity to get to know you a little bit before we jump in and learn about your career. So, if you wouldn't mind, can you help us connect Australia, sailing, and calculus with your life story?
Yeah. In a nutshell, they're three of my favorite things. I am actually half Australian. My dad's from Sydney, and I had the opportunity to go study abroad in Australia when I was an undergrad on the Gold Coast, which is, if you kind of overlay a map of the United States onto Australia, the Gold Coast is about where New York would be. And I got to explore the country. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a giant island. They have an extremely unique ecosystem, and it's just a really amazing place and with some very interesting things going on. One of the things that I love to tell people about is the trees. If you get a chance, Google the trees of Australia. Some of them really do look like they came right out of a Dr. Seuss book. It's beautiful and interesting.
That's so fun.
Sailing is one of my favorite activities. I grew up in Maryland, and I still live here in Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay, and I had the opportunity to sail starting from a young age. And I really do credit sailing and all that time spent on the water as a kid with kind of spurring my interest in the natural resources, the environment, and water quality, which has been a theme throughout my growing up and then undergrad, graduate school, and my career now with the Department of Legislative Services. Calculus, although maybe not quite as exciting to some people as Australian sailing, is my favorite math class. And I actually had the opportunity to be a TA when I was in grad school as a calculus tutor for calculus for biology students. So they were somewhat reluctant to be there, and a lot of the kids didn't really, why do we have to take calculus? I want to be a biologist. Understanding math and delving into that side of your brain is really important. And I found, I don't know why, calculus just clicked in my brain, and I always really enjoyed learning about it. And it was kind of fun. You have the graphs and all these really interesting things going on. And I actually got a math minor when I was an undergrad, which is one of the reasons I got the TA position in grad school. And in multiple job interviews that I've had since then, as well as the entrance team that I talked to getting into when I was applying for grad school, they all said, wow, you do all these social sciences and, political science, public policy, that kind of a thing. It's really unusual to have somebody who also has an interest in math. And a math minor that I got in undergrad, I legitimately credit with getting me my job that I have now and potentially getting me into law school, because lawyers historically like to say that they went to law school because they couldn't do math and they didn't have that background and couldn't do the things that they needed to do to be maybe a doctor or something else like that. And so I'm here to say that, some lawyers do like math and go for it. And it's going to show that you're a well-rounded student and person if you've got some of that extra background.
My gosh, we're just starting right in with all the great advice. I love it. No, I think that's fantastic, and it's really cool, all of the different components of STEM that you have, like with your background. And I know that Megan and I are super excited to hear more. So thank you for being here as a guest. You do so much work to protect habitat and environmental quality, especially with Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay, and all of that is super essential for plants. So let's get started hearing about your journey in the field of legislation.
So Kathleen, for our listeners, because most of the time we're talking kind of in other realms of STEM, I think we're going to have to spend some time in this episode too, kind of differentiating between a couple different policies. Also because, I'll fully admit that this is not an area of expertise that, I feel like even in...
For either of us.
Correct. In initial conversations, I've just learned so much about the entire process from talking with you. So maybe we can start a little basic.
So much about the process and how complex it is.
Yes. So maybe we can start a little basic, but could you tell us the difference between policy and law, how they're connected, and let's start there.
So the way that I kind of conceptualize this is policy is essentially you've got a goal and you've got some kind of a motivator that you're and some endpoint that you're trying to reach. And that is driven by the policy. And partially this can be how you think you can best effectuate policy change. But most of the time it's a goal. There's a problem. There's something going on that people want to address. And your laws or legislation, which are what create laws, are the end product of that policy and activism, or however you got there. Basically, the policy is what drives the ultimate end product, which is your laws. And we've got laws at all different levels. There's local laws, you've got state laws, and then you've got federal laws, and they all interplay and are related. And you can really kind of insert yourself into the policy at any of those stages. But that's just broadly how I would look at, the difference between a law and a policy.
To delve deeper into that, can you talk a little bit about the differences between law school and public policy school? Both are additional work past the undergraduate experience. But, I would love to hear more about that. And also, if you could talk a little bit about your environmental certificate that you have for both degrees, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I did, and I'm pulling in my undergrad because it's relevant to this piece of the discussion. I graduated from a state college in Maryland. It's called St. Mary's College of Maryland, and down in Southern Maryland, it's actually on the St. Mary's River. And I got a double major in political science and public policy, and I minored in math and environmental studies. Basically, I had a pretty strong background in political science and public policy. And so for me personally, the policy school, it was going more globally, because a lot of the focus in undergrad was on at least national, and I really focused on state policy. For me, the masters in public policy, they go global. You're looking at the whole world, really big topics, public health throughout other continents and other countries. And policy school they're trying to give you the tools to A, grasp what the issues are, and B, figure out how to evaluate them and how you can make changes in these different policy areas. And so for me, law school, though, is teaching you about it's really is teaching you how to read, interpret, understand, and analyze laws. And for me, they're highly linked, and that's actually why I pursued both. I went into grad school thinking that I wanted to be more of a policy person, which I am, but I felt like you really needed to have the law school component in order to know what to do to change the laws to get the policy that you want at the end. And I still believe that. I don't think everybody needs to go to policy and law school, but for me, it really taught me how to think with a different part of my brain, because I can look at a bill now and say, I see what you're trying to do here, but you might have an unintended consequence because the law is actually not written how you intend it to be. I think that's how I would look at it.
Well, it sounds like a really unique, because you have a unique background with both of those, major content areas, kind of giving you that additional context, those additional lens to look through. can you talk a little bit about your process in finding, a dual degree program? How did you navigate, if somebody is interested in, working in this realm, what kind of advice would you have for navigating that experience of finding a program and applying?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like, especially for some of these, both those lenses are important, but there is, probably a lot of nuance around understanding, especially in with a lens of environmental science, of kind of finding a program that kind of fits what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so for me, it really started pretty basic. I did work for a couple years after I graduated from undergrad, which, unsolicited life advice, I highly recommend that people do that, because for me, undergrad was learning how to learn. It opened my eyes. I was extremely undecided going into college about what I wanted to do. So I kind of took everything, which is how I wound up with the double major and double minors. And then I got a job after college, enjoyed it, but knew that it wasn't something that I wanted to do forever. It was really good experience, but it wasn't really the final field that I wanted to be in. And so that's when I started looking at what I wanted to do. And I was looking at state policy. And for me, the environmental policy and, health of the Chesapeake Bay, health of the water has always been a substantial motivator and something that I'm very interested in. And so my journey for grad school started with what's something I'm interested in? What do I think I want to do? And I started looking at the jobs that I wanted. And that's when I felt like the policy and law degree, dual degree, was going to help me get to where I wanted to be for my more substantial career next steps. And once I made that choice, and what I'm advising there is that you really look at a job that you think you want and then go to school to get that job, as opposed to just, different people approach this differently, but grad school is expensive and it's a huge time commitment. And so to the extent that you can focus that on something that you think is going to push you towards where you want to be in life, I think you'll be really happy in the end. And once I decided that's what I wanted to do, I actually just started Googling, and I just looked for schools that had the dual degree program, and B, had strong environmental studies programs. And for me, I live on the East Coast. I wasn't really that interested in going to the West Coast unless I had to. And the three schools that wound up being highest on my radar were the University of Vermont, that does offer a great dual degree program, Georgetown University in DC, and the University of Maryland here in my home state. It's interesting with the dual degree program because everything I learned online was that essentially if you apply for the policy school and get in, which is a little bit easier, it's not as competitive as law schools, then you had a higher chance of getting into law school once you're pursuing that dual degree program and you're already in the policy school. And so I had to make a bit of a gamble. And for me, I got into both Georgetown and Maryland. And then I was looking at the price difference between what a 4-year degree from Georgetown, graduate degree from Georgetown would cost versus the University of Maryland. And so I would have probably had to live in DC, which is much more expensive than living in Maryland and the county that I live in. And I felt like since I wasn't probably going to pursue a career in corporate law or private law, that the name recognition that you get from Georgetown versus Maryland, which is a great law school, wasn't really worth it to me personally. So as an in-state resident, I decided to take my chances with University of Maryland, a really well-regarded school. Not, like I said, not quite as well known, but a really solid education, and pursued it. And I started with the public policy degree first. That's where I met Jessica.
Yeah.
And then I applied for law school in that first year of policy school, thankfully got in and completed the degree in 4 years.
So I really like the advice that you gave about kind of like finding a job that you want and then kind of back, working at it kind of like from a backwards design perspective. My mom is a guidance counselor, and she still had, when I was in high school, this like giant vocational handbook that had like a lot of different positions and like the different degree programs. And it got loaned to like all of my friends in high school because it was like, well, what job, like, what do you need to like, work backwards? Like, if this is where you want to be, what maybe could be some decisions to make? I just think that's a different perspective to have. It helped me choose my master's program because I kind of realized I wanted to be more non-formal ed. And so I kind of looked at like, well, what is that, what does that look like? What types of programs should I be looking for? So I think that's super important advice to highlight. But I just think that's such a cool part of your process and kind of choosing through that. So anyways, I just thought that's a cool thing to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. That's something when I've had interns in the past, one of the first things I have them do is review job boards, find what jobs are of interest to them, pick out 3, what certifications do you need? What's the commonalities between these jobs? So, what can you start doing now to prepare you to get them? So the fact that you just provided that great insight for having that guide your actions and leading to some really practical and smart decisions for you. I just think that's fantastic advice. So thank you so much for sharing that.
One thing, if I might add, it also, I talked about the process getting into school, but you can also do this when you're in school. So if you have a broad idea, you're pretty sure you want to be in a certain field. For example, I actually toured the Department of Legislative Services, which is where I work now, in my second year of law school. And I was like, wow, this is my actual perfect job. It's this melding of law and policy. I would really love to work there. And so in my final 2 years of grad school, I started focusing more on state level policy classes. And I did that both at law school and the master's program. So even if you have a more broad idea initially, to the extent that you can intern at places that you think you want to work, get experience and look at their job, like Jessica said, look at the open jobs, see what you need for DLS, for Department of Legislative Services, you need a master's in public policy or a law degree to work there. So I was pretty well in the door with the larger degrees, but the specific classes and specifically Maryland state policy classes came up in my job interview and were, I think, helpful for actually getting the job in the end.
That's great. That's great advice. Now, I know you said you toured where you work now when you were in grad school. So I think it's safe to say you probably didn't know when you were a little kid that you were going to work for the Maryland General Assembly. So can you tell us, what did young Kathleen want to do with her life?
This is actually one of my family's favorite stories because when I was little, my parents said, "What do you want to be when you grow up, Kathleen?" And I said, "I want to read." And we always laughed because, my mom she said she had this image of me marching off to work, and I'd get there and they'd say, "All right, Kathleen, we got a really long book for you to read today." This is a doozy. And we always laughed about that. But at the end of the day, the majority of my job is reading and writing. And I'll also say that for law school as well. It is a lot of reading. I am a fast reader. I love reading. And while they can make some accommodations for you, if you need extra time for, tests and things like that, if you're not a reader, I would say law school is maybe not for you. But for me, it was this just absolutely perfect job because I just get to read and consume large volumes of text all the time.
So we know that you're maybe not handed a book each day you start your day. But we'd love to hear more about your overall position, kind of describe what that looks like. I also know, and this was part of some of our initial conversations and planning around when we were going to talk with you this season, that we planned around session, which was not something that that term was completely new to my lexicon. So can you talk us through a little bit about what your role is currently and kind of what session looks like? Maybe if it's helpful to talk through a project or an example of kind of something you work through in a given year. But we'd love to kind of get a little bit more, dig in a little bit more into what your work looks like.
So I work for the Department of Legislative Services. It's a nonpartisan professional staff for the Maryland General Assembly, which is the state level government for the state of Maryland. So we have the House and the Senate, and then DLS, which is the Department of Legislative Services, basically provides backup and support for them and the public. We're actually a statutorily created body, so that we're created by legislation. And I personally write. My primary role at DLS is to write fiscal and policy notes, which I describe as cliff notes for bills. So for each bill that is introduced, the Maryland Constitution actually requires that a fiscal and policy note be written before the bill is voted on during a voting session. And these voting sessions happen during session, which is a 90-day period from about the middle of January through middle of April. And that is when the Maryland elected officials are in their offices proposing, working on, and voting on and passing legislation or bills, which ultimately make up the laws of Maryland. And so that's during session. And during session, it's really, really busy. We're primarily just working on those fiscal and policy notes. For context, I had about 120 that I wrote this year.
Oh, wow.
I think we've got about 25 fiscal note writers, and we're split up by subject matter area. And so my area is primarily environment and natural resources. I have a couple other sort of little smaller topics, but those are the big ones. And so that's the session work. I'm working around the clock during that time because all of the bills, all the legislation that happens in a given year happens during that 90 days. So it's a really compressed, kind of frantic schedule. I build up a lot of leave though, which is really nice. I wind up getting enough leave to basically, it's almost like being a teacher, except my leave's a little more flexible. It doesn't all have to happen during the summer. But during the rest of the year, which we call the interim, we are doing analysis, summary, and other support to help the General Assembly. So a lot of it is really getting ready for the next session or summarizing what happened during the past session. But another big role that I have that's primarily happens during the interim is surrounding analysis of regulations. Regulations are promulgated by executive branch agencies, which they have different names, but a lot of states have similar ones. So in Maryland, we have the Maryland Department of the Environment, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Department of Transportation, Department of Health, and it runs the whole gambit of basically the agencies that are in control of the services that the state provides to the citizens. And so what will happen is that the legislators during session will pass a bill. I'm going to give a hunting example here just because they're kind of like smaller ideas. But the legislators who we voted for in the House and the Senate will pass a bill and they'll say, okay, we're going to allow Sunday hunting. We're going to allow the Department of Natural Resources to allow Sunday hunting in Cecil County, which is one of the counties in Maryland. And then the Department of Natural Resources will have this broad window of dates. And what the Department of Natural Resources then does is they submit a regulation that implements that bill and tells the hunters what times and specific days during the hunting season that they're actually able to hunt for. And for me, for the Department of Legislative Service, well, me and the other analysts at the Department of Legislative Services, we look at the regulations that these agencies submit and double check that the agencies actually have the statutory or legislative authority to do what they're doing. And we provide an estimate of cost, that's a component of fiscal and policy notes as well. So we do that both for legislation and for regulations, which is essentially, it has the force of law, but it's just sort of a different layer of law. And it's the agencies, like I said, they don't have the authority to do it on their own. They need to have that delegated authority from the legislators. And other than that, it's mostly, we write a lot of reports, we do research, we look at topics that were trending during the past session, and do whatever background information and studies that we think will be helpful to analyze legislation in the next session.
That is incredibly helpful. And just so many nuances. That's the one thing I think Megan and I, anytime I talk to him, I'm always like, oh my gosh, there is so much going on with her job. But it's really cool that you get to be like in the heart of it all. And, session sounds absolutely crazy, but I don't know, fast-paced, ever-changing work environment. That's you kind of get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I would like it to be a little more balanced, but it is really cool to be part of the process. You're walking into the complex and you've got lobbyists, you've got legislators, you've got people working for the legislators, and everybody's got their agenda, right? They've got their policy agenda that they're trying to push forward. And it is I love it. I love being part of the process, and I love knowing what's going on for environmental policy at the state level. And I can pretty honestly say that I am well aware of what's going on at the state level in the state of Maryland. And it's exciting.
So what's one piece of advice you would give, to somebody who's been listening to this going, oh my gosh, this is for me. I want a career in legislation. What would you say to that person?
The first thing that I'd say is that there's a lot of different ways to get involved in legislation. Each state is a little bit different. Like not every state has a Department of Legislative Services, but they have something like that. And most states do, they do write fiscal and policy notes. The big distinction I think that I've noticed is that some states have a more partisan, so they'll actually give your legislators a budget to hire their own staff to do what the Maryland Department of Legislative Services does in a nonpartisan fashion. So keep an eye on that because if, I am nonpartisan, I have my own personal opinions, but at work, I am nonpartisan and I personally think our work is only as good as it is nonpartisan because otherwise it would just be written off as biased and not useful. So look at the state level and then you can look at the local level as well. There's legislation that happens. There's county councils. There's, basically legislation happening down to even almost the neighborhood level. And then at the congressional level, the Congressional Research Service is kind of like our federal level counterparts to DLS. The other thing that I would say that I wasn't aware of really before I started my job is that all of the state agencies in Maryland have legislative liaisons, and these are the people who are responding. So part of my job in writing fiscal and policy notes is reaching out to the state agencies. For me, I work mostly with the Department of the Environment and the Department of Natural Resources, and we actually reach out to them for each bill and ask them what they think it would cost to implement the bill. So we reach out to the agency that we think would be in charge of implementing whatever legislation is going through. And those are called legislative liaisons, and each state agency, like I said, they have one or more, and they're also generally involved in regulations. And so my takeaway is that you can work in the private sector, in a nonprofit, a lobbying position, something like that. But just at the state and county and federal level, there's these legislative jobs all over the place. You just have to dig a little bit.
I think it's exciting to hear that there's just such a breadth of opportunity across, within local versus state versus national levels. Because I think there's always this assumption that big sweeping change has to be done at a certain level, and there's real impacts that can happen across all different levels of government, and they're all super critical to environmental impacts. And I just think that's one, that's really great advice. And it's also really interesting to hear your process at the state level to kind of understand really what that looks like. We did share your profile with a group of educators and said, if you got to sit down and chat with Kathleen, like we're getting to do, what would you want to ask? And so we have a couple questions that I think is going to dig a little bit more into that process, but would love to share some of those questions with you and get your input.
Well, I think that this question fits very nicely with Kathleen's last response. So a perfect question asking, listeners. Can you talk a little bit about the collaboration that goes into policy? How many different voices need to be part of the process? I'm sure these voices are incredibly passionate. And, how can you incorporate your own voice?
This is a really good question. And for me, it can be a little bit challenging because as I said before, the Department of Legislative Services is staffed with policy analysts who are all nonpartisan in their professional capacity. And so I have my own opinions, my coworkers have their own opinions, but at work, we put on our nonpartisan hats, which means that we're not leaning Republican or Democrat. We're just trying to look as neutrally as possible at legislation that's in front of us and provide the most like I said, the most neutral analysis possible. And it's pretty interesting to watch. At this stage, I just finished my 9th session. So I've been doing this for quite a few years at this stage. And one of the things that I didn't realize is how long it takes for any bill, any piece of legislation to get through. One piece of legislation that I have as in my mind as a good example deals with plastic bags. And the intent of the legislation was to reduce the number of plastic bags that were going to be used and likely disposed of in the state. And unfortunately, one of the first iterations of this bill actually perversely incentivize the sale of more plastic bags. So they were prevented from giving out paper or thin plastic bags, but they were allowed to charge for thicker bags. So our guess was that it was actually going to perversely incentivize the additional sale of these larger plastic bags, which would be more plastic, more waste, not great. And so over the process, the DLS analysts, we were able to work with our committee staffers, who are the people that are these are DLS employees that are staffing the standing committees of the Maryland General Assembly. We were able to work with them. We were able to work with the sponsors of the legislation. And because the sponsors didn't want this perverse incentive to come through either. And so it wound up going through a couple of times, and it just got more honed, and I would say a better bill. That's my personal opinion in this instance, since I don't have my work hat on. And it was really interesting to watch. And this year we actually had a major climate change bill that passed. And I think this was the fourth year that we've seen it. And so it takes, you got to be patient. It takes time. But it's really interesting. So that I would say, it is a collaboration. This is one of the things that I'm really proud of with the work that we do at DLS, is that we help to avoid unintended consequences, I think, because the legislators do respect our work, and they look at what we're saying. They take it's not outright criticism, but we try to highlight when perhaps we think that, this might be able to come through, like you might be able to do this in a less expensive, maybe a more efficient way with fewer unintended consequences.
I know it's always great when we can highlight the traits that you can use in different STEM careers. And I am just getting critical thinking just in neon letters in my head right now. It's which of course with your background and everything, that makes a lot of sense. But it's really cool to see that in action and be able to see what a difference you can make using that skill. It's really neat.
So another question that came up and kind of connects a lot to probably some, these could be collaborators or maybe not, but individuals who this work is important to. There's a question from one of our educators around the fact that their students are, familiar with activism and advocacy in regards to environmental issues that they care about. Can you talk about a little bit about that, the connection between those pieces and policy? So the connection between activism and advocacy, and maybe even lobbyists and policy, and kind of how those pieces interact in the process.
Yeah, this is a nice segue, because sometimes it's a constituent just calling a legislator and saying, this is an idea that I have. I really feel strongly about it. I would like for you to do something about it. And I think legislators take that into account when they're drafting their own, when they're introducing bills and drafting their own policy. But I'd say most of the bills that, at least that I work on, are generally coming from advocates or advocacy groups. And sometimes these advocacy groups will hire lobbyists. There's a lot of interplay between those two groups. Lobbyists are, they're professional policy pushers, essentially, who are trying to look out for their clients' best interests. So for me, as a nonpartisan policy analyst, I have to be a little bit careful, because there can be some really, really useful, wonderful information coming from advocates and lobbying groups, but it's biased. So these people are very passionate. They maybe have this absolute pinnacle bill that they think is just going to solve the, specific problem that they're looking at. One of the things that I have to take into account, though, is in the broader picture, how is this going to affect things? So how is this going to affect state statute? How is this going to affect policy? And from my just sort of observations, I've noticed that in some ways these advocates can kind of, what is it? The perfection gets in the way of, good enough.
Yeah. Don't let a great thing get in the way of a good thing.
Yes, exactly. And, it's been interesting. Like, actually, we have this issue surrounding ghost permits, which are like administratively continued permits, discharge permits in Maryland. And there's not as much, it's an interesting, well, maybe interesting to me, not anybody else, but I'm just using this as an example because the first version of the bill, it actually got amended, I think, 3 different times. And they were able to bring down the cost significantly throughout the legislative process. This was actually just in one session. There had been past years, so it wasn't the first time we'd seen this idea, but they were able to substantially bring down the cost and hone in on what the advocates are really concerned with, because they were able to get the Maryland Department of the Environment, policy analysts, and all these different people at the same table talking about the issue. And so I think advocates are absolutely crucial. You just have to keep in mind that a lot of times advocacy groups they're just so focused that sometimes they have a harder time seeing the broader picture.
It's great when you're able to get everybody in the room and come together with a consensus. That's amazing. That's great. And
it's my favorite when it happens. I wish it happened more. But I tend to think that the best work product is when everyone is sitting there just having a discussion and hashing it out.
100% agree. That's absolutely. The next question we have is, now this might not be your future goals, but if you have a background in policy writing, could it lead to holding office or being a lobbyist?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen many of my colleagues kind of going in and out of nonprofit, state government, lobbying firms, and I would say fewer of my colleagues have actually gone on to become elected officials, just because I tend to think the people who are going to DLS, that's not necessarily what they want to do. I like being behind the scenes, and I think a lot of my coworkers do as well. We don't have quite we're part of the process, but we're not the ones driving, and we don't have to go stand in front of a TV screen and talk to the public broadly. But I think that, and it's one of the reasons I went into this area. If you've got solid policy writing and legislative understandings, you are set up to be a very effective legislator and or lobbyist. And I think it could absolutely lead to that down the road.
So it's been really great to chat about all the different opportunities in this field, kind of the nuts and bolts of this industry, which, is our theme for this season. We do have another tough question for you. It's the last one. It is one we ask all of our guests, and we always like to bring it back to plants. So can you tell us what your favorite plant is?
This is such a hard question for me because I love so many different plants. And one of the things I love about plants is just the variety. There's just so many wonderful plants out there. But I'd have to say for me, my favorite plant is begonias in general. They have amazing variety within the group of begonias because they can be a little bit like cranky and grumpy. They get very, very sad if they haven't been watered. They get very pale, and they get a little bit dramatic, and sometimes their branches fall off. But you can generally fix the situation. And if, for example, your cat knocks off one of the branches, you can just stick it. I speak from experience. You can just stick it right in a cup of water, and then once it's rooted, you've got a really beautiful, fun plant that you can go share with others or put back into the pot that your cat knocked it out of. So they're fun, and I've got about 7 different varieties throughout my house and garden, and I'm pretty obsessed with them.
Begonias are amazing plants. That's a great choice. I know Megan and I are nodding along in the studio here. So just Kathleen, it's just always a pleasure talking to you. And for our listeners to know, I'm so glad that we sat next to each other in microeconomics at University of Maryland. And just another plug to always maintain your networks, because you never know where that will lead. Great friendships or professional opportunities, you never know. And Kathleen, it's so cool, the different skill sets that you bring to your job, the great example of STEM, and just how you are helping enact change for the environment for Maryland. That's amazing. So thank you so much.
Thank you both for your time.
This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers, was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/plantedpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share. This is Jessica Turner-Scoff
And Megan Wiesbrook.
and we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.